So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to come here to discuss what we are doing with regard to strengthening the medical devices regulatory system in the EU. First, my apologies for not being able to make it last year. I was supposed to be here already last year, but unfortunately we had an agenda clash in the end, so it was not feasible. But I'm happy to be able to be here this year to discuss these issues with you. As you can see, the Medical Devices Unit of the European Commission since end of last year belongs to the DG Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. You are probably aware that we had a new incoming commission from 1st of November last year, and this also meant, like frequently happens, changes in the administrative setup. So we moved then from what was then DG Health and Consumers to this DG, but this should not mean any changes with regard to our policy making, because the proposals for new legislations have already been adopted by the Commission, and all DGs, the whole Commission, aim for the same objectives for safe devices and for a functional internal market. So what I wanted to present to you today are four aspects, and I realize when I look into the program that I only have about 20 minutes, so we can stay 5 minutes on each. First, the drivers for the change we are doing with regard to regulating devices. A few words about the Commission proposals. I know that a colleague of mine was here to present it to you in the 2013 conference, I believe, so I will do this relatively short. Then tell you where we are in the negotiations, and then what do we do in the meantime, because, as was said, it will take some time before the new legislation will be adopted and be put in place in practice. So, as you all know, medical devices are essential for healthcare, but it's also an important industry sector in the EU. We have one of the largest markets. We have also some of the biggest companies, but we also have an ecosystem of small and medium-sized enterprises, or even micro enterprises that grow like mushrooms all over Europe, and especially in some regions of Europe. So we also need to bear in mind that we need to have a legislation that is sufficiently protective and provide for sufficient efficacy of the products, but we also need to have a legislation that is possible to handle from the enterprises side, and of course the small and medium-sized enterprises are particularly vulnerable in this respect. We have, as you know, for the time being, 3 directives that have been transposed into national legislation. These are based on what is called the new approach. It's not so new anymore, but it's basic principles for product legislation that are used for many, many product sectors, also for machinery, for lifts, for toys, and so on, meaning that we have the CE marking, we have essential requirements on the safety of the products. We are using standards that can provide presumption of conformity. We have notified bodies and so on. So this is nothing specific for medical devices, but it's very different to pharmaceutical products, where the legislation is based on the so-called old approach, with very detailed requirements in the legislation and public authorities in many cases that gives the approvals. What has happened in these about 30 years is that when the legislations were adopted, we had 12 member states of the EU. Now, for medical devices, we have actually 33 countries participating fully in the system. That's the EU member states, but through different agreements, also the EFTA, EEA countries, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, as well as through an MRA agreement, Switzerland, and through a customs agreement, Turkey, are fully participants in the system so we have also notified bodies in those countries, and they are participating in the system. But what this implies is, of course, also that with 33 countries having to transpose our directives into national legislation, it can become situations where this is done differently. Misunderstandings, intentional or not unintentional, I will not say, but in any case, this might create problems for keeping a unified or a safety level in Europe that is equal in all countries, and also it can create problems with regard to the free movement of the devices throughout the EU. Of course, it also means that the coordination and the cooperation becomes more complicated, with 33 countries being part of the system instead of 12. So we needed to find ways also to make this more rational and more simple to operate. Other drivers for change were, of course, the technical and healthcare developments. You know more than I do, even about scientific and technological advances. You know about the focus on prevention, early diagnosis, self-monitoring, and, of course, what we have seen from the recent crisis, the cost aspects are becoming more and more important. And we also see that patients, perhaps through the use of internet and so on, are becoming even more knowledgeable and perhaps also have higher expectations than in the past. We also see a globalization where the devices are moving more and more across the world. More and more is produced in the Far East, for instance. And therefore, there is also a need to try to harmonize as much as possible the rules. And of course, what happened very late in the process of the preparation of the new proposal for legislation was the PIP breast implants scandal that really created a lot of stories in the media and a lot of attention from the politicians as well. So there we can say that our sector came much more in the limelight than what we could ever have expected. So what we did was that we launched the work on the revision with public consultations back in 2008. The answer to these consultations were, yes, perhaps there is a need for some improvements, basically. It was a common view from almost all respondents that we should build on the strengths of the existing legislation with a good balance between pre- and post-market control. Try to keep the system flexible so that we wouldn't have too many detailed technical requirements that could be obstacles to innovation. We should, of course, ensure that we would not risk changing the high safety levels that we have, and we wanted to have a rapid access to the market for industry and for SMEs, still ensuring safety. So what was presented in 2012 in September was a Commission proposal for a regulation on devices and regulation on in vitro diagnostic devices. You can see here that we are no longer talking about directives, we are talking about regulations, and this is actually one of the means to make the system more workable, because regulations are directly applicable in the member states, which means that they should not be transposed into national legislation, and this also means that we should overcome these problems of different interpretation of the directives into national legislation that we have seen in the past. So some of the aspects that we tried to tackle in the proposals deals, for instance, with the scope, where we, for instance, propose to include also implantable devices for aesthetic purposes, because the risks are basically similar to those that are for medical purposes. We try to improve the governance of the system and the transparency, meaning, for instance, that we set up a big committee that should take all the important decisions and have some decision-making power. We propose that the EUDAMED database should be accessible to a large extent, also from the general public and from health professionals. We improve and make stronger the obligations for notified bodies. We clarify further the need and the content of what is needed with regard to clinical evaluations. And we also have looked through the risk classification and the safety and performance requirements. And especially in relation to IVD, you will note that there is a completely new risk classification system that is built on internationally developed principles. Also, the obligations for the economic operators are made clearer. The vigilance and market surveillance provisions are more detailed and clearer as well. The EUDAMED database will be expanded with more information also related to, for instance, the surveillance of the market of the competent authority, and it also deals the proposals with the traceability of devices, where we will include the UDI, Unique Device Identification system in the legislation. The transition periods that are proposed is that once the legislation is adopted, it should be 3 years for medical devices and 5 years for the IVD. And the reasons why it's longer for IVDs is that, in fact, the changes are bigger with regard to IVDs than with regard to the normal devices. But also these transitional periods are being subject to discussion. The discussions that are ongoing between the legislators, because what has happened then since 2012, in September, when we put forward the proposals, is that the Parliament and the Council started digging into the proposals, and the Parliament had a first reading vote, as it is called, in April last year. It means that they made up, that Parliament that we had then, made up their mind on the proposals. And indeed, they had some proposals for changes. At the same time, the Council has been discussing the proposals in 43 meetings now, and they are still ongoing. The current Latvian presidency is doing a good job in trying to bring the discussions forward, but unfortunately the technical issues are very keen issues to the member state representatives, and there are a lot of ideas coming up all the time, and I think that in the end the political level will have to take a strong steer on this in order to come to an agreement, a council position on this. So what has happened since these discussions started is, of course, that we have a new parliament then that came in place in the summer of last year, which means that there are new parliamentarians that will have to dig into the proposals and make up their mind. Some remain, the rapporteur for IVD, for instance, but this means also that we don't know exactly what the Parliament will have in mind when they start rediscussing the issue. But we hope that then the Council will come to a position in the spring of this year, so that the negotiations between the Council and the Parliament and the Commission can start then towards the spring, and that hopefully we will have the legislation adopted before the end of the year under the Luxembourg presidency. Why are the discussions taking such a long time, you might wonder? Well, one issue that is subject to discussion is the pre-market control of high-risk devices, where we in the Commission proposal following the PIP scandal introduced a so-called scrutiny procedure, which is a case-by-case assessment by the Medical Devices Coordination Group, the big committee, the MDCG. This has been discussed. There are a lot of different opinions. You will hear that the colleagues from industry are not particularly happy with this proposal. Some member states are also against it. The Parliament have proposed something slightly different with an enlarged scope and also a committee of scientific experts that should focus on clinical aspects, that should look into these assessments. So the products that are supposed to fall under such a scrutiny are possibly high-risk products, especially innovative products or products that are likely to have a risk of causing harm. And the idea is that this committee should have a second look on the assessment that is conducted by the notified body. Another issue is the notified bodies. There, as I mentioned, we have proposed a lot of strengthened requirements. The Parliament and Council agree with most of this and sometimes want to go even further. What Parliament has done is to propose a separate designation of special notified bodies competent for high-risk devices, and this should be then EMA doing this. So far, EMA has no role in medical devices, so this would be a first task for, well, no major role, I should say. This should be a first task for them. This is also something which we are questioning whether this is really a good idea, also in light of the measures we are already taking on notified bodies, and I will come back to them in the last part of my presentation. A third issue which is under debate is the reprocessing of single-use medical devices, where we in our proposals have proposed that if reprocessing is permitted by a member state, the reprocessor shall be considered as a manufacturer in the light of the legislation. The European Parliament has taken a slightly different approach. They would like all devices to be considered suitable for reprocessing and reusability, but there must be scientific evidence provided, and the Commission should adopt standards for reprocessing, and there should still be a possibility for member states to ban this practice on their territory. The member states have very different opinions on this, and this is partly due to the fact that the current rules in the member states vary a lot. In this country, this is quite a big industry, but for instance in France, it's prohibited. So obviously, it's an issue where one could tell that there would be divergent opinions among the member states. We still believe that our proposal in that was put forward is a good compromise for making it possible for member states to still have their own rules on this and still provide for sufficient safety. So, as these discussions are taking time, and as we have the transitionary periods in the legislation, the 3 and the 5 years, of course we could not stay inactive and do nothing following the problems that were identified and revealed through the PIP scandal. We had other problems with metal-on-metal hip implants and so forth. So there are clearly shortcomings in the application of the legislation that we needed to deal with urgently. So therefore, the Commission, together with the member states, put in place a PIP action plan, a joint plan for immediate actions, with the objective to strengthen the controls on devices under the existing legislation. And this was then put in place or proposed early 2012, and we have been implementing it since and are still implementing it. There are 4 pillars in this. It's the functioning of the notified bodies. It's the surveillance on the market of devices by the competent authorities. It's the coordination in vigilance and market surveillance, and communication and transparency. So what we have done so far under the plan is that member states were asked to reassess the qualifications and the scope of activities of their notified bodies at a very early stage. And already then, some notified bodies were given a reduction of their scope. One notified body closed down their work. And what we have launched thereafter are joint audits of notified bodies, meaning that it's not only the designating authority of the country where the notified body is located that look into the competence and qualifications and the work of the notified body, but also 2 experts from other member states and experts from the Commission's Food and Veterinary Office. So it's a team making this assessment, and this has been a quite effective exercise. We started with it on a voluntary basis, and all member states having notified bodies agreed to take part of it. And since the start of the voluntary, we have made them mandatory through one of the 2 Commission acts mentioned here, namely the one on the criteria to be met for the designation of notified bodies. So in this way, we have been through more than half of the notified bodies with such joint assessments, and about 10 of them have had to close down their activities, either because of negative results or because they decided to close down even before the joint assessment took place for reasons that have not been communicated to us, obviously. But we can also see that each of these joint assessments result in a number of problems discovered, and the notified bodies are then given a couple of months to deal with all these problems, and then it's re-verified that these problems have been solved. So it's quite an effective way to deal with the problems of the notified bodies, and it's actually one way of paving the way for the new legislation, because also in the new legislation we have put in provisions on such joint audits of notified bodies. You might ask why it's the Food and Veterinary Office of the European Commission that is involved in this. It's because the colleagues there have a very good knowledge and experience in making audits. And the techniques for these are quite similar, disregarded of if it's slaughterhouses or if it's notified bodies, in fact. So by putting together the expertise in auditing from their side and the expertise in medical devices from the competent and designating authorities side, we get a very good cross-feeding of knowledge and information that has proved to be quite efficient. We are also under the plan organizing monthly vigilance telephone conferences with the member states, where all upcoming problems with devices that have been reported and that are serious are being discussed and dealt with and coordinated. We have also started to analyze or develop system for analysis trends on incidents with the help of the Joint Research Center. We have issued a recommendation on traceability, where we recommend member states to put in place systems to meet the upcoming UDI requirements. We have also launched a dialogue with the member states on registers, and there is also a project launched on international level under the IMDRF, the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum, that is just starting, in which the project will look into how to make the best use of registers, but also how the registers should be set up and organized in order to provide the best possible information on devices. Also, member states have reported to us on how they carry out market surveillance. This was very interesting because it revealed that member states have very different habits on this, on the way they do it, on what they focus on the resources, and also we could see that there was a lack of communication and exchange of information between the member states. So this was singled out as one problematic area. So finally, as my time is going to an end, I think, I will just mention then what we are continuing doing under this PIP action plan. This was agreed in the Health Ministers' Council in June last year, where we presented a document on the implementation of this plan. and the further steps we would like to undertake. And what we proposed was that we should deepen the work under this plan on market surveillance, on coordination and communication, on the use of registers, on trend detection, and also on peer training, meaning that those member states that have good and a lot of experience and knowledge in one field should engage in training others with less experience. And just to mention, one of the actions we are undertaking now on market surveillance is that we have allocated a budget to support member states in launching joint market surveillance cooperation. So we can cover 60% of the costs for joint actions undertaken between member states' competent authorities when they conduct surveillance and controls of devices under a specific project. So this is something that we intend to continue to do, and the main objective here is to encourage member states to work together, because all of them, except one, and I will not say who, claim that they have not the resources necessary to do their job. And of course, if they all do the same job, testing the same products, checking the same products, and not communicate this to the others to share and profit from the information, of course, there will be a lot of work. But if you can work together and make sure that one product is only tested once, then that will mean that the resources can be used more efficiently. So this is one action that we are taking in this field. So by that, I would like to finish my presentation, and I hope that by this I also managed to make clear that we are not only entrusting the new legislation to make miracles in this field, but that we are, in fact, already taking measures under the existing legislation, and that these start to bear fruit. So although a lot of problems have been identified, the situation is improving. We cannot guarantee that it will be 100% satisfactory situation, because unfortunately, like in all product sectors, there can be black sheep around that have no interest in their reputation or in having a long life on the market, but that are just there to make money in a short time of period. And of course, those are the most difficult ones to deal with, and those are also the challenges for the market surveillance authorities to deal with. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a detailed overview of the situation at present. I think it's important to have discussion, so we will take a question or two after each presentation. If anybody wants to ask a question, there's a microphone in the center, and if you could say who you are and where you come from. So any questions, please. Let me start, because our colleagues from cardiology and ourselves, in both of our respective papers published a few years ago, really feel that for invasive devices and those which, as in continuous glucose monitoring and insulin infusion pumps, really could be a life threat if there was a failure, is there really not a need for a European devices agency, centrally run? And towards the end of your talk, you were making the argument for that, because you were saying that countries don't know what the other is doing in terms of post-marketing regulation, overview, etc. So is there not really, at least theoretically, there may be fiscal, well, I'm sure there are major fiscal objections to that, but shouldn't we be working towards a European devices agency for those devices, probably class 2B and 3, that really could threaten lives if there is an error? And we saw some examples of things that have gone wrong, the metal-on-metal hip implants and so on. So how would you answer that?
I would say that the answer is definitely yes. But on the political level, it's a no. just to make clear that in the Commission we are 12 persons, including administrative support staff dealing with medical devices. You might realize that this is not a very strong workforce to deal with this. What we are trying to do is to get help from the Joint Research Center in our tasks, and they are very supportive on this, but of course their main expertise is with research and perhaps not with regulations. What we have seen is that whenever the issue of new agencies is raised, that could be done until we had the financial crisis. After this, what happens is that even we in the Commission have to reduce our resources and staff. We are losing people in our medical devices unit, and of course in the light of this, asking to get resources for an agency is almost impossible. So definitely there is a need for this. We would be very pleased if that would happen, but politically for the time being it seems to be out of the question.
Thank you very much for a very honest answer. Wim Winchens, formerly IDF Europe Chair, I think.
Not anymore.
Formally, I said formally.
Thank you. Maybe I will say question at the beginning of this. I am member of the management board of EMA. We have changed last years, after a lot of discussions, to stress the benefits and then the risk, and change risk-benefit into benefit-risk. In your speech, 3 times the big scandal, and so on, and so on. So, please, you have had now your presentation, but to the other speakers, stop with the risks and the scandals, and so on, and so on. But first of all, the benefits. And I'm 77 years, I'm a whole life, a lot of diseases and a lot of complications, and we are really asking, stress, first of all, the benefits. And I know several of the speakers will do it, but it's so important. And also on behalf of the EMA, and I'm involved in the telematics, and I'm a biochemist, so I know a little bit about medicines.
Thank you very much. Wim, do you want to comment?
Yes, of course, you're right. I thought that in this forum here, the benefits are obvious, so I wouldn't have to... Yes, indeed. But the problem with the scandals, I would be delighted not to have to mention them, but the problem is that they have caused many of the difficulties we have now in the discussions with regard to the new legislation. If it wasn't for the PIP scandal, we would have had the new legislation surely adopted already. We wouldn't have had that kind of level of interest from the Parliament with brilliant or less brilliant proposals and so on. So it's clear that the scandals are really giving a shadow over our activities for the time being, and the political and the media interest, and this is why still for us this is an important factor, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. One more question. Can you come to the microphone? It's here in the middle. Yeah. Or someone will bring one to you even. No, they won't.
Very simple question. You mentioned UDAMED. Could you explain what that is?
It's a database where the devices are registered, and where also we will have in the future more information about the characteristic of the devices, and also about problems in relation to the individual devices. So this is a database that is currently not fully functional, I would say, because not all the data needed is entered there in practice, but in the future the aim is to ensure that all the data should be there, and as I mentioned also, a big part of the data should be made public, both to the general public and to medical professionals.
Thank you.
Last question over here. Tony Kirby.
Hello, I'm working with the SD to write up a report on the meeting. Could you just tell us a bit more about the notified bodies closures that you mentioned in your talk? Some of them closed before being audited, and then some of them were closed because they were audited. And were they in particular locations, or what were the kind of problems you were finding?
Well, the main problems we have found relate actually to the clinical aspects, where we have seen that many of the notified bodies are not sufficiently looking into these aspects. This is a major problem. What we can see is that several of the notified bodies are also active under other product legislations. They might be dealing with electrical product safety, with machinery and so on. And surely they have a good general knowledge, but their specialized knowledge in medical devices and the involvement of expertise in this has in some cases not been sufficient. So this is something which, when they have realized that they need to improve, need to hire more people, need to do the job better, they have sometimes said that, okay, this will cost too much for us because we don't have that big market share for medical devices, so it's worth investing the money in this. And this is probably one reason why they have stopped their activities even before or even voluntarily after having gone through a joint assessment. What we probably can foresee is that we will see more specialization in the notified bodies in the future, because clearly they need to have more specialized expertise and need to be able to assess also very specialized devices in which generalists, general engineers, or even generalists in the medical field might not always have the specialized knowledge.
Are they in particular locations, the ones that are closed? Are they in particular locations, the ones that are closed, and have you approved any new ones to start?
We have got some applications for new ones. None of them have been approved so far. When it comes to those that have closed down, I would recommend you to go to the database that we have on our website, the so-called Nandon database, where there is a list of notified bodies that have withdrawn their activities.
Thank you very much. So that's notified bodies past and present. Yeah. Okay, we must move on. Thank you very much indeed.